Tony Blair is now Sir Tony Blair. The former Prime Minister was awarded a knighthood in the New Year's honours. He is now a member of the Order of the Garter, which is an appointment made personally by the Queen. Not everyone is impressed. Over 700,000 people have already signed a change.org petition to have the title stripped from Blair, and the sentiment expressed by that petition is not a minority opinion. It's pretty widespread. So in a recent YouGov survey, 63% of those polled either disapproved or strongly disapproved of Blair receiving a knighthood, whereas only 14% either approved or strongly approved of the move. This should, of course, not come as a surprise. Back in 2003, Britain saw the largest political demonstration in UK history when an estimated 2 million people turned out to protest the UK going to war in Iraq. That demonstration came 6 months after Tony Blair made this infamous claim to MPs.
This dossier is based on the work of the British Joint Intelligence Committee. For over 60 years, beginning just prior to World War II, the JIC has provided intelligence assessments to British Prime Ministers. Normally, its work obviously is secret. Unusually, because it is important we explain our concerns over Saddam to the British people, we have decided to disclose their assessments. I am aware, of course, that people are going to have to take elements of this on the good faith of our intelligence services. But this is what they are telling me, the British Prime Minister, and my senior colleagues. The intelligence picture they paint is one accumulated over the last 4 years. It is extensive, detailed, and authoritative. It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, including against his own Shia population, and that he is actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
Those claims turned out to be bullshit. In a landmark inquiry in 2016, Lord Chilcot was damning of the arguments Tony Blair used to justify war. He gave this assessment to the BBC.
In the most simple terms, do you believe that Tony Blair was as straight with you and the public as he ought to have been?
Can I slightly reword that to say, I think any Prime Minister taking a country into war has got to be straight with the nation and carry it, so far as possible, with him or her. I don't believe that was the case in the Iraq instance.
That war would directly cause the deaths of up to 1 million Iraqis. Interestingly, amongst those campaigning to have Blair's knighthood revoked is the Daily Mail. This was their front page today. According to the story, Jeff Hoon, Defence Secretary at the time of the Iraq War, was instructed by Jonathan Powell, Blair's then Chief of Staff, to burn a legal memo in the weeks before Britain went to war. That memo apparently contained the advice of the then Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith. In that advice, he said the war could be illegal. Lord Goldsmith, in the days before the war, changed the advice. Philippe Sands is the human rights lawyer who first revealed the existence of Goldsmith's initial advice. He said, "When Lord Goldsmith wrote the legal advice warning that war in Iraq could be illegal, he can hardly have expected that those who received a copy would be told to burn after reading." Yet Mr. Hoon says that this is what he was told, offering further confirmation of what has long been known. Ministers, Parliament and the public were misled by Mr. Blair into supporting a war that was seen by many as unlawful and a crime. In modern Britain, it seems such a manifest act of wrongdoing does not preclude the offering of a high-level gong. So, we have knighted a man who is alleged to have required legal advice to be destroyed before taking Britain into an illegal war. It's no wonder 63% of the public want that honour stripped. There are some influential people in the 13% who do want him to keep it, though. One is, of course, the Queen. Another is Keir Starmer.
I think Tony Blair deserves the honour. He He won 3 elections. He was a very successful prime minister. I haven't got time this morning to list all of his many achievements, which I think vastly improved our country, you know, whether that's minimum wage, sure start for young families. But the one I would pick out in particular is the work he did in Northern Ireland and the peace process and the huge change that has made. I worked for myself in Northern Ireland for 6 years with the police service over there. And I saw for myself the profound impact it had on peace, on both communities in Northern Ireland. So I don't think it's thorny at all. I think he deserves
all right. Well, I'll point out why it's
Obviously,
thorny,
I respect the fact that people have different views.
Starmer tends to follow public opinion. On this issue, he's willing to take a stand. I guess the Sirs like to stick together.
Blair is a very interesting figure because to this day, he really does unite sort of most of the political spectrum of British people in their disdain for him. You know, I always feel quite proud when I see those statistics of how much people will basically not let Blair's atrocities in Iraq go unremembered. It feels like one of the few acceptable forms of international solidarity that we're still allowed these days. And the only group of people that are in any way interested in rehabilitating Blair's reputation is the kind of self-appointed, manufactured centre, which basically consists of a few dozen people. And it goes to show you that those who relentlessly in the media and in the political sphere self-define as moderate or centrist, often it's just a key word for establishment. Because, and this is perfectly an example of this, because much of the so-called centrists are in favour of this knighthood, but much of the actual British public aren't. And let's not forget, you know, that's what the purpose of a knighthood kind of is. You know, the purpose, and, you know, we tend to get outraged when abominable people get knighted, but knighthoods aren't badges of moral clarity. It's literally a way of the elite marking themselves and the sort of occasional outsider with a reward for allegiance, basically. And so Blair very much fits within that rubric. But I think it's absolutely right that every time Blair's name is mentioned, we bring up the 1 million Iraqis who were needlessly killed by that war, because no number of sure start centres or whatever else can overshadow the atrocity that took place at every stage of that war, the lies and the attacks on democracy that took place in the lead up to the war, the violence that took place during the war, and also the instability and harm that continues to take place in the region as a knock-on effect of that war. You know, we're not just talking about children who are still being born with congenital health issues as a result of toxic chemicals that were used in the Iraq War, but we're also talking about the ongoing political crisis that the region is experiencing. You know, the Middle East is often talked about as if it's this kind of pathologically unstable or kind of conflict-ridden part of the world, but that's not the reality. That doesn't make any sense. It is a region that has been made unstable, and the war in Iraq, the 2003 war in Iraq, was a huge part of the perpetuating of those conditions. You know, the rise of ISIS can be connected to the political fallout that took place as a result of the Iraq war. And no amount of domestic policy successes make that okay. But I think it's also important to talk about those so-called domestic policy successes, you know, the kinds of successes that we're told needs to be taken into account when we talk about Tony Blair for balance. Many of those so-called successes were not even successful in any kind of sustainable way. Like, when was the last time you actually saw a Sure Start Centre? Many of these successes were overturned very shortly after Blair's tenure because the broader right-wing shift that took place in Britain, the destruction of the left that took place in Britain as a result of Blairism, the indulging, for example, of stereotypes around benefit scroungers, around bogus asylum seekers, this kind of cultural and political trends within Blairism created the context for the total destruction of the welfare state that we saw during austerity. So even those sort of marginal wins, those kind of crumbs that we got during the Blair years, the broader political shift that took place, political economic shift that took place under Blairism, meant that they were very, very easily turned back when the Conservatives came into power. So given that, whilst Blair won, multiple elections, I would argue that he didn't produce domestically, and obviously certainly not internationally, the kinds of long-term successes that we would expect from a 3-term Labour government. So basically, he's unpopular, unsuccessful, and unscrupulous. So I would say that sounds about right for a knight, to be quite honest.
I kind of like, he is actually perfectly suited for the role, to be chosen by the Queen as actually someone who has stood up for the British Empire. I mean, he increased Britain's influence around the world just in an incredibly nefarious way, making us responsible for, well, not just the deaths that were directly caused by Iraq, but as you said earlier, the instability that was caused in the Middle East. And also, I think, what you say, he left the gains that were made incredibly vulnerable because he hadn't empowered the working class. He hadn't fought against the demonization of people on benefits, and in fact had actually fed it. And very significantly, never did anything to take on the power of Rupert Murdoch. So Rupert Murdoch still remained a huge power in British politics, which meant the moment the wind changed, we were all screwed.